All right. Okay. So I think we'll get started now, and other people may join later on. And of course, this is being recorded, so people can catch up on that as well. So some people join and do that for the recording. So good morning, everyone. My name is Gavin Reddick. I'm the Chief Analyst here at ResearchFish. And the webinar today is to run through some of the stats in ResearchFish across the Q1 2026 submission period. So we do this after the end of the Nordic and UK multi-funder submission periods and cover a number of different pieces of analysis on activity in the platform over the year and over the last quarter in particular, although obviously we're not quite at the end of Q1, and so you should bear that in mind as we go through. This year, when we get going, you should keep in your mind there are three different types of activity that have the potential to impact some of the statistics throughout. First off, this period sees the first deployment of the OPS, so the outcome priority schemes. And so this is a mechanism that enables funders to communicate to researchers that particular sections are either of higher priority, of standard priority, or not being asked to respond to for that particular award. And the purpose of this is to try and focus researchers' attention on those sections. So things like collaborations, further funding, policy influence that are of particular interest to the funders for that particular scheme, and to move people away from areas, particularly in reality, many funders have selected things like engagement activities or use of shared facilities as sections that they want to flag to people to not spend the time on. And so we've had this new piece of functionality. It's designed to help focus that, reduce effort in some areas, and refocus the time elsewhere. So that's the first piece coming into the submission period. The second is a little bit of a change in some of the behavior, some policies around the Nordic submission period in terms of how that was run. And then also finally, the news which came at the end of January this year that ResearchFish as a platform is going to be sunset in July next year. And so that has the potential to cause some change in behavior as well. So we have those three different things to keep in the back of our mind as we look at this series of charts and figures. So now I'm going to go through. I should say, if you have any questions on a particular figure or a topic, please let us know as we go through, because it'll be easier to address any questions while we're on the slide than to get all the way to the end and come back. So please feel free to do that. And with that, I think we can get started. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the time taken to report. So this is a key metric. So we talk about researchers, users spending time on the platform. And to do this set of statistics, what we do is we look at the sum total of all user time on ResearchFish from January 1, 2016. So it's a good period now. And what we do is we look at that actual total of time taken, and we look at how many awards were submitted, and we assume that all of the time spent on the platform is wholly and solely related to those awards submitted. So if somebody were to log on and then go and make a cup of tea, that would still count as time on the platform. If someone were to go and read some help documents or something like that, but not be involved in any submission, that would still count. So we do this because this gives us the most conservative estimate about the time. So we're the most expensive definition of user time in ResearchFish to produce the award submission. And while we can focus on system administrators, admins, for funders, ROs, centers, etc. We do focus on the researchers, the people that are doing the reporting on the awards for this particular analysis that we're going to look at right now. So first off, we look at the ResearchFish user time. So this is the full year for non-admin users from 2016 to 2025. So obviously we don't have the full year of 2026 yet. And so you can see the blue line captures how many awards have been submitted in that calendar year. And on the orange bars, we have how many minutes, the mean average, essentially the user time per award. And so you can see on the full year stats, it's been fairly consistent at about 48, 49 minutes, slightly higher than the Q1 times. The Q1 times are based more around researchers, more awards that have some level of frequency, particularly in the UK. The rest of the year is a combination, and so people tend to spend a little bit more, so that's what brings the time up. But you can see that over the last 2 years, this annual figure has increased. So going up from 49 in 2023 to 52 minutes in 2024 and 53 minutes in 2025. So obviously we want to try and align the time that users spend on the platform with the things that will produce a valuable result, but we also want to try and make sure that it's as efficient as possible. So that's the total year figures, but we also look at the Q1 figures. And so the Q1 figures, first of all, where you'll see the impact of some of those topics that I mentioned at the beginning. And what we can see is a significant and substantial reduction in the user time in Q1. So as you can see, it's been fairly consistent at a little under 45 minutes per year per award. So that's the average amount of user time to submit an award in ResearchFish. And this has dropped down to about 37 minutes. So that's about an 18% reduction. So obviously there's a number of pieces at play. We mentioned the ops being the thing that's designed to try and help focus and reduce extraneous user time. And so there's more that needs to be dug into, and you'll see that some of those analyses as we get into the more detail, but certainly we've seen a very substantial reduction in the average amount of time it's taken to submit an award in ResearchFish. So that's quite welcome from that perspective. Next, you can see here across the annual user time, some of the key call out points that we look at. So you'll see here on the orange line, the lower quartile. So 25% of the users within a year spend that time or less. So for example, across 2025, of everybody that logged into ResearchFish, 1/4 of them spent 10 minutes or less on the platform. So that's how you would interpret that. Next, we have the median. So that's the 50% point. So if we look in 2025, 50% of users spent 31 minutes or less on the platform over the total course of 2025. And then you can see on the mean side of things, the mean is above the median, which means we have some outliers pulling up overall. And you can see the mean is closer to the upper quartile. So the upper quartile means that, for example, in 2025, 75% of all users on the platform spent 77 minutes or less on the platform as a whole, and 25% spent more than that, and there's a chunk on the upper end which is dragging that mean up. So to try and get a better sense, we look in chunks of user time. And so we see here how many people, what percentage of users active in that year spent 10 minutes or less, or 10 to 20 minutes, or 20 to 30 minutes. And you can see a few things. So we already saw that 2016 had that big reduction as there was a change in design of ResearchFish. And you can see that since then, actually the number of people, the percentage of people spending 25% or less on ResearchFish has been sorry, 10 minutes or less has been pretty consistent, running between 25 and 30% of all the users in the year. And this is the whole year figure. So again, this doesn't include Q1. But what we can see is on the upper end of things, so the users spending more than 2 hours on the platform over the course of the year, that's been ticking up over a number of years. And in 24 and 25, where we saw those higher annual numbers at all, you can see there was a bit of a step in there. So about 15% of users were spending more than 2 hours a year on the platform. Another way of looking at that figure, just to try and take out all those binned ones, is to look at how long users spend for relatively quick sessions. And by sessions in this context, I mean across the whole year. So this orange line here shows the percentage of users in a given year that spent 30 minutes or less on the platform. And so you can see it's been pretty consistently between 55 and 50%, dipping down a little bit over the last couple of years. And you can see those users spending more than 2 hours has been drifting up a little bit. So you can see those two ratios there. And whilst we're in 2026, we're only looking at a single quarter, and these will move, you can see that it's in the sort of the right kind of direction, so that the percentage of users spending less time on the platform is going up, and the percentage of users spending more time on the platform, extended more than 2 hours, is going down overall in terms of the mix. So I will pause quickly there. Does anybody have any questions on the user time? So the overall takeaway is that Q1 this year does seem to be a little bit different and moving in the right kind of direction. Yes, Paul, and can I ask Alexandra if you could unmute Paul so he can ask his question, please? I may be able to do that. Let me see.
I think I'm unmuted.
Okay. Excellent.
So I was interested in, and not to name individual funders, but do you have data that kind of indicate that funders who use some of the prioritization more aggressively have seen a bigger drop in user times, and those that maybe have kept their policy the same have not seen a reduction in user times? Or yeah.
So the user time figure is a little bit challenging because quite a lot of researchers report to more than one funder. And so it's a little bit hard to disentangle at this stage. What you'll see a little bit later on is looking, again, it's a macro level, so across all funders, but is looking at some of the impact of those areas where we know that ops have been more heavily used to discourage particular sections, and we can see different behavior in those relative to what's going on overall. So you should see something coming up that might get to that.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Perfect. All right. And Chris, you've got your hand up.
Oh, yeah, am I unmuted? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so given that quick sessions are going up and extended sessions going down, do you do any work to look at whether it corresponds with the quality of response? Have you noticed, do you do anything to notice whether the quality of response has gone down as well, or is that maintained?
So we've got some of the mix of the type of things. Quality is obviously quite a subjective word. So we do have, but I don't have slides on them today, looking at essentially the volume of text that's completed in some of the more manual sections, which can sometimes be used as a proxy. There are some caveats around that, but obviously it's quite difficult to say around what is quality. Part of the ops approach is really saying that these particular types of outputs are ones that we don't want you to focus on reporting, which would be isn't the same as quality, but it gets a little bit to the concentration. And as with Paul's question, You'll see a little bit about that coming on as we get to the attribution analysis, which is in a little way on today. Okay. And so with that, let's look at the next step. So we've talked about user time, but in Research-Fish, we also talk about user activation. And so user activation is where we look at essentially when the user logs onto Research-Fish for the first time in any calendar year. So across this, you'll see three main types of analysis, user activation being the first one. So when the user logs on for the first time, the next section is going to look at the attributions. So this is the work that users are doing to add the information into Research-Fish and report against the award. And then finally, we'll look at the award submission. So we're going to look at each of those three slices in turn. The user activation does look at that first time login. What we do, and you'll see this as a recurring theme throughout a number of these figures, is we apply a time shifting methodology. And so we don't want to compare the 1st of March with the 1st of March last year because there are some different and significant patterns. So the actual timing of the submission period can move and days of the week can change from one year to the next. And these have significant impacts on user behavior. And so what we do is we do a time shifting methodology to line up essentially where we are in the submission period to make drawing conclusions across years easier. And so what you can see here is on each individual day, how many people logged on for the first time. And so there are a few things around this. So we're going to focus on these individual years, primarily on 21 through 26, rather than the whole time series. You can see, as I mentioned, some strong similarity year on year. So you can see those 2 days each year that are lower are always going to be the weekend. And you can see here at the start in January on the Nordic submission periods, and then you can see later here when the UK multi-funder submission period starts in early February, and you can see the first day very clearly. And then you can see each of the weeks of the submission period leading up to the last week. And so you can still see there are very significant numbers of people logging on for the first time in the last week. You can see the variation year on year, and this typically is caused by different comms strategies, so different emails going out that drive those user spikes. So you can see in 2021, so this spike here in week 4 of the UK multi-funder submission period went out, and you can see the impact of it there. You can also see that at the beginning of the submission period, it's actually very similar year on year, because there's a percentage of people that will go and do that pretty much no matter what. And then you can see over here in the extension period side of things, so this is afterwards, there may be some other submission periods running, or some funders have extensions that are live. You can see those patterns playing out a little bit later on. It's tricky to look at each individual year here. So what we do is we sort of zoom in a little bit, and you can see here in the gray the maximum and minimum areas over previous years from 2016 to 2025. And then the blue line is where we are this year. And so you can see in terms of user activations in January, they were a little bit lower, particularly on that last week in January. And so that's one of the things that we'll come back and see. And then throughout the UK multi-funder submission period, things have been lower than the minimum points on a number of occasions, and generally speaking at the lower end of things. So this looks at this year relative to previous years. If we were to zoom in and just look at the difference year on year, so comparing Q1 2025 to Q1 2026, we can see in this figure here the change on each individual day. If the change was positive, you'll see the bar is blue. If the change is negative, you'll see the bar is orange. And then we tie all of those together to give an overall understanding about where we are. So you can see that in the end of January which is about here, we were a little bit below last year overall. So we'd started off low, picked up more relative to the year before, and then actually had ended January a little bit lower there. You can see throughout February, things drifted down day on day pretty consistently, and then actually changed, and then over the last few weeks have gone up day on day. But overall, we're still a good chunk below where we were last year in terms of the number of people that have been active in the platform in Q1. In fact, we're about, at this point, about 773 users fewer have logged on in Q1 this year than last year. But you can see that 773 is contextualized by, about 36,000 people having logged on. So it is lower, it is significant, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not massively substantial in terms of the overall numbers. And I should say that this is extrapolating out this year. You can see that gap between the red, which was last year, and this dark purple, which is this year. Obviously, that we have a few more days to go in terms of Q1, and so that number will go up and potentially go above the 2024 year as well. And we can see here, if we just look at the maximum and minimum points, you can see that in January, we were on the upper end of things in previous years. And then in February, we were on the lower end of things, and we've pretty much kept station over there, relatively speaking, building up a little bit around here towards the end. So before we move on to the attributions, are there any questions on the user activation figures? Any thoughts, comments, questions? Okay, seeing none, let's look at the attribution. So obviously, once the user has logged on for the first time, they then can take action in the platform. And so the attribution analysis looks at the date that when outputs were attributed in the platform. And we'll see a number of time-shifted figures in the same terms as in the activation ones. So I'm not going to spend as much time explaining them because you should have the sense of that now, hopefully. And what you can see here is, in contrast to the user activation, when we look at the outputs attributed per day, we can see some patterns. So we can still see the weekends coming clearly, but we can see a lot more noise year on year, a lot more difference year on year. We can see some very big spikes. We can see in 2024, and to a lesser extent in 2025, where we had some big harvesting events. So this is where Research Fish were able to go through and add new data on behalf of researchers as we're pulling in new sources. And you can see that again in 2023. So some of that is driven by the harvesting. Some of that is driven by different communications. And again, you can see there's a lot of activity going on at the last week of the UK multi-funder submission period. And if you look day on day, you can see a pattern of typically being at the lower end of the attributions. And again, this is an area where, because of the use of OPS, the outcome priority schemes, the behavior that's being suggested is essentially to reduce the number of attributions in some areas. And so you can see, in fact, we were on the lower end of attributions most of the time. And you can see below minimums over the last couple of weeks. So weeks 4 and 5 of the UK multi-funder submission period particularly, but then moving into sort of a more normal range in that last week, but obviously lower than some of the spikes previously. When we look at that year-on-year difference in attribution, so again, this is the same methodology, looking at each of the days so we can see clearly when the dips occurred or when the peaks occurred. You can see that it was consistently lower throughout January, with some activity going in just before the UK multi-funder submission period, so some harvesting events there, and then has been pretty consistent in having fewer new attributions per day in Q1 2026 relative to Q1 2025. So ending up, as you can see here, at 170,000 below where we were previously in terms of common outcome attributions. So Paul, this gets to your question from a little bit earlier. So what do we actually see? What makes up that difference? So the first, and a little bit surprising, was the reduction in publication attributions. So actually the biggest single area here were in publications. And publications is in one of those areas where actually a lot of the activity is driven by harvesting, so a big chunk there. And over the last couple of years, we had some new sources coming in, some new elements going on that we're adding year on year. And this year is perhaps a little bit of a regression to the mean, and we'll get into that a little in a few slides' time. But the biggest single drop in outputs, common outcomes, were publications. But the next biggest drop were in dissemination activities, so engagement activities. And to Paul's question, this was one of the sections that if people used OPS, was a very common one that they indicated they did not want researchers to report in this section. So you can see a very substantial reduction in the number of engagement activities reported over this period. So you can see over 40,000 fewer year on year. And also one of the big ones was both in terms of numbers, but also in terms of utilization of OPS, personal recognition. And so you can see a similar pattern. So across each of those, we can see fairly consistent patterns. And with the exception of publications, where we don't believe that's necessarily being driven by OPS, these two were sections where people were discouraged from reporting through the use of OPS. Not all funders, and we'll see a little bit that gets to that question in a few slides' time, but those are the sorts of reductions that we would expect given OPS if they were working as intended. When we look at cumulative outputs reported, you can see, this year it is the lowest across any of the previous years. So this purple color here, and you can see the last couple of years, the blue and the red were benefiting from those harvesting events and ended up on the higher end of things overall. So year on year, so comparing the red of 25 to the purple of 26, we're about, as I say, over 160,000 fewer attributions at this point in time. There are a few more days to run in the quarter, but we expect that gap to stay pretty consistent. And again, if we just look at the maximum and minimum points, you can see how throughout it's been on the lower end of things. And then when we get to sort of the end of February is when we get into the lowest out of each of the years from 2016 on over. So as I said, there are a number of factors at play here in terms of the attributions and some behavioral changes over time. This next figure looks at the absolute number of outputs and looks at the attributions by quarter of each year, and also looks at what the source of it was. So this light green at the top, those are manual outputs. So those are where the researcher has had to write the whole output themselves. Next, on the purple, you'll see those are what we call Search Plus. So the user has leveraged some of the search integrations in ResearchFish, but has had to manually add some additional pieces of information. So an example of this would be in the collaboration section, where they might be able to search and identify a collaborator that has sector information, geographic information, but they're adding some information about the particular collaboration. Next, we have the blue, which is the search, And this is where the user is able to use one of the API connections or databases to be able to find their output, select it, and report without needing to do anything manually. That's the whole output. This dark green color is personal harvest. So this is where we've been able to harvest the output entirely, but there is no attribution to a grant. And so it's put into the researcher's personal portfolio. And then the researcher has subsequently added an attribution to that output. So they've taken it from their portfolio and attributed it to an award. So an example here would be sort of an ORCID-based integration. The orange is where we get information uploaded from research organizations, and the dark blue is where we're able to harvest, and we're able to add not only the output to the researcher's portfolio, but also to the awards as well. And so if we look at this view, you can see Q1 each year is the most significant year for a significant quarter of the year for attributions, and that's consistent. You can see that the other quarters of the year have gained in number relative to that Q1 activity over a number of years. But you can see here quite clearly, whilst Q3 of 25 was higher than previous years and had a substantial difference in terms of the harvesting there, you can see that in Q4, for a number of different reasons, the harvesting was less, and actually that wasn't caught up with in Q1 2026. So it wasn't just that things didn't happen and 2026 we're able to backfill, but there are fewer things overall. And in part, this is more consistent harvesting, and in part, there just seemed to be a little bit of a behavioral change that's gone on. We still need to unpack exactly what's the driver there, but you can see fewer publications harvested, and that's one of the big components in the reduction of the number of publications attributed in Q1. You can also see the impact of the overall number in Q1 being lower than in the other Q1s. If we look at Q2 through 4, you can see that generally speaking, that have been increasing in importance throughout the course of the year. So there's more activity going on outside of Q1, and you can see the percentage of the year reported there. So in 2024, 1/4 of all of the new attributions made were made in quarters 2 through 4. But you can see a very large number of those were harvested. A smaller number were added. You can see in 2025, not quite a regression to the mean, but you can see it's very similar to the 2023 Q2 through Q4 pattern. If we look at that 12-month ending in this Q1, again, you can see the number of attributions across this reporting cycle being lower. You can see the absolute number of manual outputs dropping as well, even though the percentage in the mix has gone up. So the absolute number has dropped. The percentage of the 12-month total has gone up. And you can see that across the more manual intensive things. So the Search Plus and the search, and you can see the harvesting elements have gone down over this period. So, but again, those other cycles were benefiting from new sources, which enabled us to backfill and have provided a sort of a one-off boost around that time. But there does seem to be some additional behavioral change going on as well. One thing that is clear is that people are perhaps getting a little bit better at indicating if they're minting a DOI, for example, for a publication that already has a DOI, including the appropriate metadata to make that connection and prevent us creating duplication, and also potentially actually reduction of that activity overall as well, which might be one of the factors that are reducing that. So less harvesting, but also more accurate harvesting as well. And this just looks at the same data and gives you a sense of how that mix is changing over time if we look across those 12-month rolling periods. So you can see the sort of widening of the manual in the 12 months ending Q1 2026. If we look at the individual output types, what you can see here is in terms of the number of publications, you can see in 2024, the Q1 attributions were very high. In 2025, the publication attributions were higher than previous years, so a little bit higher than 22, a fair bit higher than the other years. And you can see that difference there in absolute terms from Q1 26 to Q1 2025, actually quite a big drop in the number of publications. So if you think back to that year-on-year difference that we looked. Across the other output types, we can see these very big dips in the dissemination to non-academic audiences, so that's the engagement activities, and the awards and recognition. You can see dips in the other output types as well. So these numbers are going down, but obviously you can see that some of those numbers on the dissemination activities proportionately have gone down more. And you can see some of the behavior in the other output sections. There, it's a little bit tricky to look at those numbers because of scale, but you can see the difference here in influence on policy, which is continuing to go up, versus the other sections, which are pretty much going down. It's worth saying the research datasets, databases, and models sections, you can see that big spike in purple, so 2024. So that's one of the harvesting spikes that we mentioned earlier. And in fact, if we look at the absolute numbers from this year and last year, so you can see this year is orange, last year is blue. You can see the year-on-year differences across those different sections more clearly, with the exception of influence on policy, where whilst the overall number was down and the numbers were down across all the output sections, that number bucked the trend and went up. In that section, everything else has gone down. And if we look at the percentage difference year on year between Q1 25 and Q1 26, you can get a sense as to the outliers. So those things that saw the biggest percentage decreases year on year, and those were, with the exception of publications, sections where ops were used most heavily. So the biggest drop was in the facility section. So you can see not quite 70% reduction year on year. Dissemination to non-academic audiences, you can see not quite 60% reduction year on year. And awards and recognition, almost 50% reduction year on year there. So we think this is ops in action based on what we know. There's a little bit more detail that needs to be dug into to help with that. You can see a reduction in the overall number of outcomes reported across the other sections. And again, some of these also have ops applied to them as well. But you can see the influence on policy, a year-on-year percentage increase. So this is one of the pieces that we think that help it to point in the direction of ops being successful, although there is still more analysis that needs to be done. And you can see this here in terms of the shift in the mix of the output types. And so again, those sections, obviously publications, saw the biggest drop in percentage terms in terms of the mix of outputs in Q1 25 to 26. You can see those three sections that were heavily used in the ops, again, had the percentage decreases in the mix year on year. And you can see the other outcome types going up in the mix, relatively speaking. So if there were 200 outcomes, essentially and you got rid of all the same ones and you only had 100 reported, then all of these would be at 0. So if the mix didn't change. But if the percentage of publications dipped year on year, you would see the negative percentage there, which we do see, and we'll see the increase in percentage across those other ones. So what we think is the ops is having a positive effect. We will need to dig into it a little bit more, but I think the initial figures are really quite encouraging. So that's quite a lot of discussion around the attributions and the harvesting and the effective ops in the mix of things year on year. Does anybody have any questions or comments on this section? Paul?
Yeah, so it's the reduction in publications is quite dramatic, and I think some of it is just the fact that the UK is producing less publications across the patch, and there are other data sources that show that, although they do link back to some research-based data, so it's a bit cyclic. But have you got? Do you think this is? Is there any bits of researcher behaviour that funders should be concerned about? So from UKRI's perspective, we obviously changed the way we award grants through a different system. They have different grant references, and I think there is some confusion. So I think one of the things we'll be interested in knowing is whether that change has affected the likelihood of people acknowledging that grant. But do you see any sort of more general patterns in kind of people just not using the possibility of enabling that interoperability by acknowledging grants properly, or do we need to do more on that? And that just another question, there's always this piece around what's the scope for interoperability, and some of that is the bit that they can use the lookup to get it, where if they just put the grant attribution in there, it could have been automatically harvested. Have you seen that? Is that look to me, look, it's been fairly flat, and where you'd hope that there'd be more positive change there.
Yes, that was a surprise to me that side has gone down in terms of we run things several times because it seemed very odd that after an overall trend of increase, the acknowledgement routes seem to have decreased. With the UKRI award specifically having multiple IDs, we added functionality to allow for that, and also funders minting DOIs for grants that to be handled as part of that to enable all of the different IDs to be used in terms of the harvesting. But despite that, there is that reduction. Some of the confusion might not have helped. On the UKRI side of things, I think the Horizon Guarantee activity has caused some confusion in terms of how that can be acknowledged. We've certainly seen some of that in terms of who is recognized as being the funder, which has an impact overall in terms of the harvesting. And also a greater increase in people referencing UKRI as being the funder rather than BBSRC being the funder, for example, which again adds some level of confusion that sort of has a negative impact around interoperability. So there are a few things going on. The reduction was surprising. I think we need to dig into that a bit more. We've done a number of things to try and compensate for those different elements, but whether there was more that we could have done that would have helped with that, I think we'll only see when we really dig into the data. But that's a UKRI specific thing, which obviously is a big chunk of the data, but it's not the only one. And it seems to be more general across a number of different organizations. There is also a dip in the personal harvest being used as well. So that's a little bit puzzling. It would make sense if the overall number of publications has been reducing, and also if the sorts of things that are being referenced are changing as well. So one of the things that I mentioned was where research organizations mint their own DOIs that are essentially refer to a copy of a publication in their own repository within minted as a DataCite DOI when it might have a Crossref DOI. There's scope within that schema to make that connection clear, and if they do, we make use of that and avoid creating a substantive duplicate. So that seems to be better used. And it may also be the case that that sort of minting of those DOIs in the first place potentially might have gone down a little bit as well. So, which would be good if essentially everybody's using the same ID for the publication. It's a surprise. It's not something that I was expecting, but it is something we don't have a good answer for apart from those sort of things that I mentioned. Does that answer or address all of your questions and points?
Yeah, it's very helpful, Gavin. Thank you so much.
Excellent. No worries. Are there any other questions on the attribution harvesting side of things? If not, then let's look at the final part of the cycle, which is actually the award submission. So, and again, we're going to use the same approach on time shifting. So if we recap across this Q1 period, we have had fewer numbers of users active in ResearchFish, so about 700 odd, so fewer than last year, but not a substantial percentage difference. So it is a few percentage points down. So fewer people active in the system. We've had a big reduction in the amount of new attributions created. And so now we're going to look and see, has that had an impact on the actual submission process itself? And so if we look on the daily activity, you can see, again, that similar pattern of weekends, the similar pattern of the UK multi-funder submission period, the very sharp increase on the last week of the submission period. You can see over a similar kind of activity around the Nordic side. And then you can see the different extension periods there. And again, some of the variance year on year being driven by particular comms going out to different people at that point in time. If we look at just this year, you can see there have been times when we've been at the minimum of 2016 to 25, and there have been other times when we've been more substantially up overall. If we look at just this year compared to last year, you can see across on the Nordic side of things, that change in behavior that I mentioned meant that at the end of that submission period relative to last year, we were about 100 awards fewer overall than we were. So that was the starting point on the UK context. And then throughout the early part of the submission period, and in fact through to the end of the submission period, while there were different peaks and troughs, we ended up across the main period as being lower than last year, but not by very much. So fewer than 200 awards, fewer in terms of submissions. And then you can see across the last period, some big year-on-year increases that mean overall in terms of submissions, we're about 600 submissions higher this year than we were last year. So one of the concerns sort of at the beginning was that perhaps with the sunsetting news, the submissions might go down, but that doesn't seem to be the case. One of the drivers here for this quite sharp increase year on year, so there's always that submission activity afterwards as people do wrap-ups, maybe we're aware of some funders having particular communications issues in reaching out to researchers, and so they might not have been receiving funder comms in the period during the submission period, and are now receiving those comms, which is accounting for some of those steeper increases potentially. So that's the year-on-year difference. If we look cumulatively, you can see there is some variation year on year for sure, but there is very consistent submission activity across all of the years from 21 to 26, again, which is a bit higher than at this point in a few of those different years. And you can see where we are from 2016 to 2026 essentially. So we are on the lower end because the number of awards in some of those earlier years were higher, before some funders changed policies around how long they were going to go back to awards and removing some types of awards, so studentships, for example. But that number over the past few years has been very consistent. So that's in terms of awards submitted. So that seems very consistent with previous years. With the submission process, we also look at the time taken to process submissions. So when a user clicks submit, there's a lockout period where the data is being copied. So during that period, the user can't make changes to their data. This can be stressful if the researcher is submitting to more than one funder, because during that period, they can't go in and submit to the second funder. And so we look here and see how long it took for that process to happen. And so you can see across the dark blue, the percentage of awards that took 30 seconds or less. And so you can see in Q1 2026, 46% of submissions were processed in 30 seconds or less. So that's the lockout time. And another 30%, 60 seconds or less. So together, that means more than 3/4 of submissions were processed in less than a minute overall. You can see some longer ones. So you can see in the purple, for example, which looks at more than 5 minutes. So about 10% of those submissions took 10 minutes or more, 5 minutes or more to process. So this happens at particularly busy time periods. This can take a little bit longer. But you can see that that more than 5 minutes has been getting better, really. So we were sort of at 14 and 12% over the last couple of years, and so we're back at 10% this year. And then finally, on the submission side of things, we also look at response codes. So this looks to see across particularly response code 1, which is where a funder is expecting a submission, and response code 4, where they're expecting a submission, but the researcher has moved organizations, so the contact information may not be accurate, and it's more challenging for that. If we look at response codes and award start year, so the different cohorts, what we can see, which is fairly typical, is that independent of when the award started, they typically have the same year-on-year percentage submitted. So at this point in time, across Research5sh as a whole, for response code 1 awards, for each of those award start years, it's typically looking currently as a submission rate of about 90%, a little bit below for some years, a little bit above in other years. But broadly speaking, that's where we are. The blue line on the blue bar are where the user has activated, so they've logged on, but they have not clicked submit. So there might have been some activity, but for whatever reason, they haven't clicked submit. And then the amber is where the user has accepted an invitation, but have not been active in Research5sh this year. So those amber bars are that difference. And then the red are where the user has not accepted the invitation, so they couldn't submit. So that gives you a sense as to where they are overall. The 2025 numbers are a little bit lower than you perhaps would expect. So there's a higher chunk of the red relative in that year, for sure. I would expect it to be maybe a couple of percentage points higher in terms of the submission, but what you can see is fairly high and consistent submission rates across years. And with response code 4, you can see a similar pattern year on year. The absolute numbers are a lot lower, so there's a little bit more noise, and the overall submission rates are lower. And again, this is because of the challenge in communicating with those researchers who have moved institutions. And the funder doesn't necessarily have contact information for them. So that's where we are on submissions. So overall, as I said, fewer people active, not massively so. fewer attributions by a substantial amount, largely concentrated in those sections where ops were used to indicate not to report. But even with the reduction overall, an increase in both absolute and percentage terms in policy influence, which is one of those areas where funders using ops have typically also indicated a particular interest in that. So in terms of the attribution behavior, also fewer things able to be harvested. Then finally, in terms of submissions, it looks like actually a fairly consistent year, slightly higher numbers of submissions this year relative to last year, and overall good compliance overall. Are there any questions on the award submission side of things, or of anything overall? Any questions, any comments? Okay, well, seeing none, hopefully you found that useful. Obviously, there are quite a lot of figures and quite a lot of discussion going through the stats. So I appreciate everyone sticking with me. And if you do have any questions that occur to you afterwards, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to go through anything with you. But yes, so otherwise, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And any questions, just let me know. All right. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Gavin. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.